my gay paradise. We came here as friends, just two married men, escaping our routines for a week of sunshine and peace. But the island had other plans. The warm breeze, the endless ocean, the quiet moments alone. Something between us shifted. It started with a touch, a glance held too long, a whispered confession. And before we knew it, we had crossed a line we could never undo. But paradise doesn't last forever, and neither did we. Stay until the end, because some love stories aren't meant to survive. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more captivating stories like this one. Now, let's dive in. The island was supposed to be an escape. A week away from our lives, from responsibilities, from the expectations that came with being husbands, professionals, men who had it all together. When Elliot suggested the trip, it felt like a breath of fresh air. We'd been best friends for over a decade, growing alongside each other, sharing milestones, venting about our careers, our wives, our lives. But lately, something had changed. Maybe we had drifted apart, or maybe, deep down, something had always been waiting beneath the surface. And this island, this paradise, it was about to bring everything to light. We arrived on a warm afternoon, the salty breeze wrapping around us like a welcome embrace. The resort was small, private bungalows perched on the white sand, each with an open view of the endless turquoise sea. Not bad, Elliot mused, tossing his duffel bag onto the bed as we stepped into our shared bungalow. Not bad? This is paradise, man. I laughed, stepping out onto the balcony. The ocean stretched out before us, undisturbed, endless. Elliot joined me, leaning against the wooden railing. He was wearing a simple white shirt, sunglasses perched atop his dark hair. At 30, he looked just as he did when we met, just a little more worn, a little more weathered by life. Hard to believe we actually made this happen, he said. No work, no responsibilities. Just us. Just us. Something about the way he said it sent a strange feeling through my chest. I pushed it away. I say we make the most of it, I said, nudging his shoulder. No schedules, no stress, just the ocean, cold drinks, and forgetting the real world exists for a while. Elliot grinned. I'll drink to that. The first night we sat on the beach, a bonfire crackling between us. We drank, too much maybe. We laughed, louder than we had in years, and somewhere between the drinks and the firelight, the conversation turned deeper. Elliot swirled his drink, staring into the flames. Do you ever feel like we missed something? I frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated, then let out a dry chuckle. Forget it. But I didn't let it go. Come on, Elliot. We're in paradise. If there's ever a time to say what's really on your mind, it's now. He looked at me then, really looked at me. And for the first time, I realized how much I had stopped seeing him. We had spent so much time moving forward, marriages, careers, responsibilities, that we had never looked back. Never stopped to wonder if we had taken the right road. Elliot exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know, man. Just, sometimes, I wonder if we ever had a choice. If we ever stopped to ask ourselves what we really wanted. The fire crackled between us. Something heavy settled in my chest. We had choices, I said, but the words felt hollow. Elliot's eyes flickered toward me, unreadable. Did we? For a moment, there was only silence, only the waves lapping at the shore, only the fire casting shadows across his face. And then, he smiled, like he hadn't just shaken the foundation beneath my feet. Anyway, he said, standing up and stretching, we should get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. We're going to make the most of this place, right? I nodded, but as I followed him back to the bungalow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already changed. And paradise? It was only just beginning. The next morning, the island was alive with golden sunlight and the rhythmic sounds of waves crashing against the shore. I woke up to the scent of salt in the air, my body still heavy from the drinks of the night before. Elliot was already up, standing on the balcony, staring out at the horizon. He had a coffee in hand, his shirt loose over his broad frame, his dark hair still damp from a morning shower. For a moment, I just watched him. Something about him felt different, or maybe it was me. I forced myself to break the silence. "You're up early." He turned, flashing a small smile. "Couldn't sleep." I joined him, resting my arms on the wooden railing. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, the sunlight dancing on its surface. It was beautiful. But all I could focus on was the way Elliot's fingers tapped restlessly against his mug. "Still thinking about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Elliot exhaled through his nose. "I don't know what I was talking about. Must have been the drinks." Liar. I didn't push him. Not yet. Instead, I nudged his shoulder with mine. "Well, whatever it was, let's not waste today thinking about yesterday." His lips quirked upward. Agreed. We spent the afternoon exploring the island, letting the sun and salt water wash away our hangovers. We swam in the crystal-clear water, the heat of the sun burning our shoulders. We hiked up a small rocky path that led to a secluded cove where the sand was untouched, the waves calmer. Elliot was laughing again, his usual self. And yet, there was something in the way his eyes lingered on me, something in the way his fingers accidentally brushed against mine when he passed me a bottle of water. Something in the way his breath hitched when I pulled my shirt off, letting the sun hit my bare skin. I felt it too. I had felt it for a long time, but I had never let myself acknowledge it. Here, though, away from reality, away from expectations, I was starting to. That evening we sat on the beach again, watching the sun sink into the ocean. Elliot was lying back on the sand, arms behind his head. I sat beside him, my knees bent, beer in hand. The sky was a canvas of gold and violet, the air warm and heavy. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then he broke the silence. "Remember when we were 20? His voice was low, thoughtful. I smiled, remembering those years, reckless, free, filled with nights that never seemed to end. "Yeah," I said. "Feels like a lifetime ago." Elliot hummed in agreement. "Back then, I thought life would always be that simple. Just us. No expectations. No pressure. Just possibilities." I turned my head to look at him. His eyes were still fixed on the sky, his expression unreadable. "Do you regret any of it?" I asked. He exhaled. "Not regret. But sometimes I wonder, what if things had been different?" I swallowed. There it was again. The words unsaid, the weight between us, the possibility that had never been explored. I didn't know if it was the island or the way the sunset painted his face in soft golden hues, but something inside me snapped. I reached out. Just barely. Letting my fingers skim over his wrist, testing the waters. Elliot stilled, but he didn't pull away. He turned his head, our eyes locking. The air felt thicker, charged. We had been here before so many times in different ways, but never like this. This time, there was no one watching. No reality waiting for us outside this paradise. There was only him. Only me. Only the space between us that wasn't really there anymore. Elliot's breath was uneven. I could see the way his chest rose and fell, the tension in his jaw. This was the moment The moment where we either ran or fell. And then, he reached for me, too. His fingers curled around mine. It was barely anything. A touch. A connection. But it felt like everything. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And neither did he. Because in that moment we both knew this wasn't just the island. This wasn't just the drinks. This was us. And it had always been. That night, neither of us spoke about what had happened on the beach. We walked back to the bungalow in silence, the weight of unspoken words thick between us. My skin still burned where his fingers had curled around mine. It had been a simple touch, barely anything, but it felt like it had split the world open. Inside the bungalow, Elliot moved around the space like nothing had changed. He peeled off his shirt, tossed it onto a chair, grabbed a bottle of water from the counter. His movements were too casual. But I wasn't fooled. I saw the way his fingers trembled slightly when he twisted off the cap. I saw the way he kept his back to me for too long, like he was trying to get himself under control. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. "Elliot." He stilled. Then, slowly, he turned around. His expression was careful, too careful, like he already knew what I was going to say and was trying to convince himself it hadn't happened. "What?" I hesitated, suddenly unsure. Did I want to push this? Did I want to say the words that would make this real? Because once I did, there would be no going back. The island was too small, too quiet. There was nowhere to hide from the truth. And the truth was suffocating us. I let out a breath. "We need to talk." Elliot gave a short, dry laugh. "No, we don't." I frowned. "Come on, man." "We don't," he repeated, sharper this time. "It was nothing. Just the island, the heat, a stupid moment." Liar. I stood up, closing the space between us in 2 slow steps. He didn't back away, but I could see it in his eyes. He was fighting himself. "You don't believe that," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "I do." I shook my head. "Then why are you shaking?" Elliot froze. My words hit him like a physical blow, his breath hitching, his whole body going stiff. I reached out, slowly, deliberately, and brushed my fingers over the inside of his wrist, the same way I had done on the beach. His pulse was racing. I looked up, meeting his eyes. "Tell me to stop." Silence. Elliot's lips parted slightly, his chest rising and falling too fast. He wasn't breathing normally. He was holding it in, holding everything in. Then, in a single movement, he grabbed my wrist and ripped his hand away. I thought he was going to storm out, to leave, to escape this moment before it swallowed him whole. But instead, he stood there, shaking his head, gripping his own hair like he was losing his mind. "This isn't happening," he whispered. "Elliot, this isn't happening," he insisted. "We're married. We have wives. We're not—" He cut himself off, squeezing his eyes shut. He couldn't even say it. I stepped closer. "Elliot." He turned away, breathing hard. I could see the panic crawling up his spine, the fear, the war raging inside him. So I gave him space. I backed off. I let him stand there, let him process, because this wasn't just about tonight. This had always been there, waiting, simmering under the surface of everything we had built. Elliot let out a heavy breath, rubbing his hands over his face. "I need air." And before I could stop him, he walked out. I didn't follow him. Not yet. I let him go. Because the truth was already out there, and neither of us could take it back. Elliot didn't come back right away. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, waiting. But the hours passed, and he didn't return. Outside, the island was quiet. The waves crashed lazily against the shore. The wind whispered through the palm trees. Paradise, they called it. But it didn't feel like paradise anymore. It felt like something was breaking, something we couldn't put back together. I finally found him near the water. He was sitting on the sand, legs pulled up, arms resting on his knees. The ocean stretched out before him, black and endless under the moonlight. I hesitated, then slowly lowered myself down beside him. He didn't look at me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he broke the silence. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. His voice was raw, hoarse, like he'd been wrestling with himself for hours. I exhaled. "You don't have to do anything right now." Elliot let out a hollow laugh. "That's the problem, isn't it? If I don't do anything, then this is real." I turned my head, watching the way his fingers dug into the sand. His whole body was tight, like he was barely keeping himself together. "It is real," I said softly. Elliot finally looked at me. His blue eyes were stormy, wild with fear and longing. "This can't happen," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. I studied him, my heart pounding. "Then why are you still here?" His breath hitched. I could see it. The exact moment he realized he had no answer. He should have walked away. He should have left me sitting on that beach. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for me. His fingers tangled in the fabric of my shirt, pulling me closer. Not roughly, not desperately, but like he was giving up the fight. And then, his lips were on mine. It wasn't careful. It wasn't soft. It was everything we had been holding back. His hands gripped my shoulders, his breath ragged against my mouth, his body pressed against mine like he was drowning. I kissed him back. I let him drown, because so was I. When we pulled apart, Elliot looked ruined. His lips were swollen, his breath uneven, his hands still clutching my shirt like he didn't know how to let go. His whole body trembled. I cupped the back of his neck, trying to steady him. "It's okay." But he shook his head. "No," he whispered. "It's not." Then, he stood up, and before I could stop him, before I could say anything, he walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving me alone, leaving us alone. And for the first time, I knew this wouldn't end well. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I could still feel him, the weight of his hands gripping my shirt, the way his breath had hitched when he finally gave in, the way he had kissed me, like he was unraveling, like he had been holding himself together for too long. And then, he left. Now, the bungalow felt empty. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft crash of the waves outside. I should have gone after him. I should have done something. But what? What the hell was I supposed to say? That it was okay? That it didn't change anything? But it did. It changed everything. Morning came, and Elliot was still gone. I searched for him along the beach, near the docks, even at the tiny beachside bar where we had sat drinking just a couple of nights ago, before everything had spiraled. Nothing. By the time I found him, it was already midday. He was in the water, waist deep, staring out at the horizon like he wanted to disappear into it. For a moment I just stood there, watching him. The sun glowed on his tanned skin, his wet hair sticking messily to his forehead. He had his hands on his hips, his shoulders rising and falling with deep, heavy breaths. I exhaled. We couldn't keep doing this. I stepped forward, letting the warm water lap at my ankles as I walked toward him. "Elliot." He stiffened, but he didn't turn around. I waded in deeper, stopping just behind him. "You can't keep running from this." A sharp breath, a clenched jaw. Silence. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm not running," he said, voice quiet. I scoffed. "Really? Because it sure as hell looks like you are." Elliot turned to face me then, and his eyes were wild. "You think I wanted this?" he hissed. "You think I planned for this to happen?" I stared at him, the sun gleaming in his wet lashes, his lips still pink from the way he had kissed me last night. "No," I said. "But you wanted it." His face twisted. He cut himself off, his fingers curling into fists. "It was a mistake." Something sharp and painful twisted in my chest. A mistake. I had known he would say it. I had expected it. But it still hurt like hell. I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodding slowly. "Right. A mistake." Elliot let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his wet hair. "We have wives, man. Lives. We can't do this." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Then why did you kiss me?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because he didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did. Maybe he just wasn't brave enough to say it. I took a step closer, the water shifting around us. "You keep saying it's wrong, but you don't look like someone who regrets it." Elliot's breath caught. His gaze dropped to my lips. There it was again. That pull. That electric, dangerous gravity between us. I reached out, brushing my fingers over his wrist, just a touch, just enough. He sucked in a breath, and for a second he didn't move. Then he broke away. Fast. Too fast. Like he was afraid of himself. "I can't," he choked out. He turned and waded back to shore, leaving me standing there, the water rising and falling around me, the weight of everything we weren't saying crashing over me like a tide. That night, he didn't come back to the bungalow. He wasn't in his bed. He wasn't anywhere. And as the hours passed, a terrible feeling settled in my gut. Something was wrong. And the next morning, I found out just how wrong I was. I knew something was wrong before anyone said a word. The air felt different, heavy, suffocating. I woke up to the sound of voices outside, muffled, urgent, the kind of voices that made your stomach twist before you even understood why. I stumbled out of bed, my heart already hammering, and then I heard someone say it. "A man. In the water." I ran, out of the bungalow, down the wooden steps, toward the shore. The sun was blinding, but I barely noticed. All I saw was a small group of people gathered near the rocks where the waves crashed harder than anywhere else on the island. I pushed through them, my breath stuck in my throat. And then I saw him. Elliot. His body was limp, soaked, his dark hair plastered against his forehead. His skin was paler than it should have been, his lips slightly parted, as if he had been trying to say something before. No. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I reached for him. His face was cold. His chest. God, his chest wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. "Elliot," I choked, shaking him. "Come on, man. Wake up." Nothing. I felt hands on my shoulders, someone pulling me back. I fought them. "No, I can help him. I can..." But the reality was setting in. The truth was settling in. Elliot was gone. And I never got to say. I never got to tell him. I never got to tell him that I loved him. The next few days passed in a blur. The officials ruled it an accident. A tragic misstep near the rocks. A man who went for a late-night swim and never came back. But I knew better. I knew Elliot. And I knew what was running through his head last night. The guilt, the fear, the war inside of him. He had been fighting for so long. And in the end, he lost. I sat on the same beach where we had shared our first real moment. The same sand where he had looked at me like he wanted to say something but never could. I pressed my hands into the earth, trying to ground myself, trying to feel him. But he was gone, and paradise had never felt emptier. Some love stories aren't meant to last. Some are too big, too heavy, too complicated to survive the world outside of paradise. But does that make them any less real? Tell me, if you could have something, even for just a moment, knowing it would end in pain, would you still take it? If this story made you think, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who believes that love, no matter how brief, is always worth it.